Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, More Features, Less Pain, Modern Scripting Tools for Today's Applications, sponsored by Apica and featuring their lead solutions engineer, Doug McAfee, as our speaker today. I'm your host, Beth Romanek. Thanks for joining us. Before I hand it over to our speaker, let me explain this console you see in front of you. All three panels on your screen can be moved around and resized. At the bottom of your console, you'll also see a widget toolbar. By clicking the Handouts widget in the middle, the one that looks like a piece of paper, you can download a PDF of the speaker's slides. If you have any technical issues, please let me know by typing in the Questions and Answers panel on the left. This is also how you submit questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation. This web seminar is being recorded and will be made available to watch later on demand. Once the recording is ready, you'll get an email with instructions about how you can watch the whole presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our speaker, Doug McAfee.
All right. Thanks, Beth. All right. So thank you for joining me. I'm excited to take you on a journey through more features and less pain for the modern scripting tools for today's applications. So now that I have your attention, and before I ramble on for the first few slides here, I do want to direct you to www.apicasystems.com/scripting tools with a hyphen between scripting tools. We have some really big updates here at Apica. We have two brand new tools that we just released this December, as well as another big update to another one of our tools. And that is ZebraTester 6.0, a major version update. If you're familiar with ZebraTester, it's our classic full-featured scripting GUI and highly scalable load engine. And for those not too familiar, this is really the proprietary engine that powers a lot of the transactions here at Apica. I've spent a lot of time scripting with it. It's really it's an enterprise-grade scripting tool, very comparable to something like Load Runner. And like I mentioned, I've been able to script from scratch some of the hardest scenarios with branching and looping logic that prospects and customers have thrown at me, and been able to do so in under a week. And to put into context, I don't know how to script in C, nor do I get to work with ZebraTester every day. So I think that really speaks to its power and simplicity as well. It's similar to tools like JMeter, Visual Studio, Load Runner, and having all the power, but not requiring that specialized knowledge or skills prerequisite. You know, we at Apica like to brag about its power. You know, we have a lot of faith in it, as well as our customers and our PS ability to create any type of simple or complex script. And you know, we're confident because we really haven't come across a script that we're not able to produce. So I mean, we're kind of holding that title since 2012, since it's been in the toolkit. So like I mentioned, really big update for ZebraTester 6.0 with it's including HTTP2 support, running Java 10 for the load agents, some really powerful WebSocket capabilities, including things like configurable payloads and offsets, new compression support. And although most of you might already know in some of the conversations that we may have had or in releases, the ability to run Load Runner files bound in C. Some big updates there. But I'm going to be spending a little bit of time today talking about Apica IDE, and that's in the center here. It's really, you can think of it as a GUI update or a GUI reskin of ZebraTester, but specializing in the ability to chain API requests with ease, including the ability to parameterize headers, things like items in JSON content paths, really anything. And in addition to that, we can add inline code without having to spend hours in some obscure JavaScript library or learning about it to build pre-request scripts to link them together. It's a really nice tool, especially for users that may not have been fond of the classic look of ZebraTester, but still having all the power, like the ability to add Java plugins to extend the functionality. Like I mentioned, I have a short demo upcoming that I think would be pretty fun. So if you're on the West Coast and still haven't decided where to go to lunch today, even though it is Taco Tuesday, I'm going to chain together some API requests to help figure that out for us. And if you're on the East Coast, maybe we can have it pick out something for dinner, perhaps. And then lastly, here on the left is Apica YAML. This is a different approach, actually, that gives us a lot of flexibility to API testing. So unlike the previous two tools, we're not going to map variables to something that we see in a response. but declare them before we make the requests. And in addition to that, we're also going to be scripting as code rather than from a GUI. And it's pretty neat. And with this tool, I like to say, we don't need the chicken, or we don't need the egg before the chicken. We can collect, or we can import collections from tools like Postman and Swagger, and take the content that we've already assembled and chain them together. And since these all three of these share the same file formats, whether you want to chain them together from a GUI or from code, it's going to give us a lot of options. And I'm really excited to see what the community and the user base is able to accomplish with this format. That's over with the commercial for now, but to finish off my comments on our updates, our product updates are really driven in response to what our technical account managers see on the front lines with customers, but also trends, taking a step back, that we see across the industries that we serve and that we help. And the first of all being the trend to improve the current processes with software that we see. We see the gaps in the tools our customers are using. And at Apica, we have the specialization, and we believe we know how to improve them. And I want to help solve the problems that you face there with your current processes, with the tools that we have to offer. And second of all, to embrace and enable automation. The solutions that we craft, they're not designed to be done once. We want them to be repeatable for you so that we can hook into this industry trend for automation. So I have them here at the bottom of the screen, and I want to give them all a shout out. All of the updates that we're seeing here are inspired and stimulated by our fantastic product team. First of all, led by Sven, who's our founder here at Apica and now our chief product officer. He truly embraces our customers' future with Apica. So if you're ever visiting us, or our headquarters in Stockholm, you can find him on the dev floor. So, and that's no joke. Next, Troy Presley, who some of you may recognize. He actually did a talk at a Techwell event not too long ago, and I'm kind of jealous because that conference hall was packed wall to wall at the Disneyland Hotel. He's our former head of solution engineering, former developer, and genius. He's the head of our product manager for our synthetics, incorporating our solutions into production monitoring and testing. And then finally here on the right, Johan Sandberg. He came from a rather large bank where he implemented automation using Apica, saving hundreds of hours of QA human resources each test cycle. He is the product owner of our load test platform and our scripting tools. So if you had signed up in the previous links there at the top, he is going to be the one serenading your inbox with the product updates, as well as any information for any updates to the software that you download there from the links. Now, I know that webinars can be preachy and we throw around phrases like the age of agile, but really these catchphrases are starting to become a lot more serious and a lot more real. More organizations and IT management are not only pushing initiatives to quote unquote shift left and hook their current processes into an automation flow, but the customers that our organizations serve, especially end users of development, QA, testing, and monitoring efforts, they're expecting it. And when I say customers, that could be anyone downstream of the services that we're validating, really. Anyone downstream in the software development lifecycle. And that could be the IT department that maintains or supports the infrastructure that we're testing. And that could even be us. We could be the department. We are our own customers of the scripting and automation that we're validating. Could also be third-party services relying on us as customers who have their own customers of those services. First of all, kind of complicates this is the ever-increasing number of devices, operating systems, and screen resolutions. There's a growing number of permutations that we need to test here that are extending the efforts if this is to be done from the UI or from a manual scripting standpoint. And kind of as a 1.5 to that, just below, is the proliferation of mobile for both web and native applications. And kind of with that, responsive design. So previously, the validation testing that we were doing was relied upon as a catch-all, but that isn't there to catch all anymore, especially in the functional testing that we're doing. To both to all of these points here, all three, testing at the top layer to validate core functionality is no longer sufficient, and quite frankly, is too brittle to be reliable over time. I mean, we know that testing from the UI level is brittle enough at a manual effort level, but if we're testing from the UI layer with automation, it's going to break our automation too easily. Moving center and to the right, the other point here is the propagation of microservices. And IoT has been a big buzzword for webinars like these, and it still is a big deal. Don't get me wrong. We have some very heavy-hitting IoT customers of our own. But as I was saying, the propagation of microservices is not just a buzzword, but a challenging reality for all of us. Microservices are hard, but I think orchestrated properly, they're immensely powerful for your applications that are relied upon in ways that a monolithic application can't be. So the solution then is to reprioritize the framework to test and to monitor those critical APIs. And how do we do that? Well, I think it's actually kind of straightforward. Let's decouple our functionality testing from the UI. We perform this type of testing within our systems testing for things like API unit tests. And those give us a reusable baseline where the changes to our application can be more anticipated in our testing. But now, as we get into separating our API unit testing into further on right in the process, you might say, Doug, well, Dev already performs this, systems testing for APIs with each build. It's elementary. It's almost it's pretty much expected in the process, right? It's something that we can automate. And to that, my response would be that library of calls, that collection in Postman that we have, it doesn't really tell a story unless we have some really smart proactive devs who've already chained these together logically and parameterized the variables for us to reuse later on in the life cycle. And doing these things like correlating and chaining these APIs into meaningful objectives, that can be difficult. But the trade-off being, even though it is hard, once it's perfected, once we have it down, then the automation can much more easily fall into place. And after all, the end goal of automating that API testing, we're not relying, like I mentioned, on that proactive dev who's going to, do work for the other departments. But we actually can free up their time, not rely on them to be proactive, and do things that developers should be doing, like write code, for example. Automating also enables us to cover a more full scope of the testing that we do. We can do more precise positive testing, negative testing, and test more edge cases as well, making sure that we're leaving nothing up to chance and that all the parameters and permutations are tested. So moving on here, when I started preparing for this webinar, I was reading through the great content here on the Techwell site for some inspiration and for some slide content as well. But there was one article where I just kept nodding my head while I was reading through, and that was 3 Ways to Keep Your Test Suite Lean by Megan Lewis over at GitHub. And pretty much every single point here can be directly answered by the implementation of API testing. And I mean, obviously, at the beginning, make test value. Obviously, we start making sure that the testing is for the most valuable aspects of our applications. I mean, I understand that over time, the value can be lost to technical debt, for example. But questioning the value should not be overlooked, especially when we're looking to shift left, because we all know that phrase, garbage in, garbage out. But if we're not interrogating the value of the tests, we're going to have, and I love this visualization. I wish I had some clip art for you, but garbage on an automation conveyor belt. It's just going to go round and round every test cycle and clutter the true value behind the garbage that we're testing that perhaps is perhaps being tested twice or taken for granted. Next, making the tests reliable. So going back to the visualization of the testing layers in my previous slide, if there's any chance that we can eliminate the fragility of validating our functions from a UI trigger, removing that fragility is going to fortify the reliability of our tests when we're doing API testing. Essentially, decoupling that functional testing from the UI is going to guarantee reliability in the tests. And finally, making tests fast. I mean, Megan says outright in the article she writes, let's avoid testing in the UI and look for opportunities to automate features at lower levels like API testing. So reading from Megan's post and really from a lot of the teams that I speak with, having the right tool to test their APIs is not just something that they desire, but to make their tests valuable, reliable, and fast, it's becoming a requirement as we shift left. And quite frankly, management doesn't want any garbage on the conveyor belt when we start hooking into automation. So let me pause here for a second because I've been talking about API testing fitting into automation, which is that buzzword becoming more and more serious. And I'd like to use Jenkins to show this example here. And I'm a visual person, so I really like Jenkins Blue Ocean. It gives me the layout, but also forces me to string a more virtualized automation group together rather than having it existing separately on its own. So this is very similar to what it would look like. I had some screenshots, but I think that gets a little bit too busy. So going one at a time here from the left, first, the build. We're not part of the picture yet unless we're also dev in this scenario, but let's say we're not. Next, we get to doing our unit testing, for example, in JUnit. Unit testing APIs to ensure that those individual components are functioning properly. There's several tools where we would just look across at that entire system-wide and do a system-wide validation of the individual functions. And that would be something we'd accomplish in the unit test. Moving forward, we'd once we have a success and we have our green check mark, we're moving over to our functional testing. And here we're using actually those, from an API testing standpoint, using those same API collections in the unit test. But here we're accomplishing these functional objectives, and we can do that by using testable data with the APIs, or chaining them together, or even chaining them together with this data, or perhaps hooking into third parties to validate the functional objectives that we want to test. And so from there, we're going to move one to the right now to the performance test. And I hope you can see we're not changing much here. The APIs are kind of existing all along the life cycle. So performance testing is no different than the previous two. We're using what we've already sort of built up in the previous stage, using our functional tests, not changing anything really. We're just creating mixes of users within those tests, and we're saturating our build at different levels of load to validate the relative performance. And that could be a smoke test, a stress test, an endurance test. It could be even a ready for business type check, perhaps a performance test in production, or a light smoke test to validate that we're set for business that day. That's all something that we can do as a performance test stage. And finally, this is pretty much where most of the webinars I've seen, or most of the content that I've read, stops here. And we've done our testing or our validation. But I think we're really missing something, and that's we're ignoring how the application is actually used in production by the users that we're servicing, like I mentioned. So I think actually those previous three components, we can handpick from the individual units that we want to test, the functions. We can handpick from those and proactively in production, proactively monitor those. Like I mentioned, kind of like performance tests have a proactive ready for business type check. We can do proactive operations monitoring where we're monitoring the individual units from the unit test, or have that operations monitoring be more geared to a realistic user SLA, we wouldn't use simply the individual API units, but we'd actually group those functional units together and build our SLAs or have our SLAs reflect the actual functions, not just the independent components as green or red lights as they exist in the environment. So that's it from the theoretical here, but I really want to showcase a demo for all of you. And now that we know the ways of the force, let's take this this knowledge and let's take this to our tool, and hopefully now that we've gone through the 3 objectives of knowing how to design the test, we can now wield our tool like a pro. And I know this is the first time some of you are seeing the IDE, so hopefully we're not losing any hands along the way here. So I'm going to share my screen. And I think I'm getting a thumbs up here. All right. So here I mentioned that I'm going to be chaining some APIs together and figure out what we're getting for lunch. And I know this is kind of a goofy example, but I'm actually going to be using a couple of services here, actually 3 or 4 unique services, 2 from Google, 1 from Uber, 1 from Twitter. And I'm going to be chaining together, first feeding my address in to the Google Maps API. And then from there, I'm going to be getting my location coordinates. I'm going to be sending them to Google Places, where I'm going to do a nearby search for restaurants, and then take that nearby recommendation, take my starting and ending coordinates, feed them to Uber, figure out how long it's going to take my Uber to pick me up to take me to this restaurant, and then I'm going to share it on Twitter. So like I said, I know it's kind of goofy, but this example could be very similar to other business cases that you may be using. For example, say we're making a call to get users applying for financing, and then a separate service is doing a credit lookup on them. And then from there, we are making a decision where we're, say it's the credit score, and we're doing a yes/no logic before we feed that user record to then fill out an application and post that to the system. Or for example, say we have an API that is registering a vehicle. This is, Apica works a lot with smart cars. So say that the vehicle service is creating a user record for a VIN number, coordinating that, or posting or creating a record that is linking their GPS or media services to their phone number. Perhaps it's continually posting, or we continually want to test posting data to a service center, like mileage or tire pressure, or something like that. Or even, and actually this is a case where you could say that Apica has actually saved lives, is chaining together accident alert systems to the appropriate government third parties, making sure that a request that's sent that posts a notice of an accident or something like that is all, first of all, tested, but also constantly up in production. Chaining these APIs together, even though this example is a bit silly, or maybe it isn't, maybe it's really a crisis every day for lunch, like it is for me, where we're going to head, can be done by very simply chaining these calls together. So here is the IDE, and I actually have a couple of calls already assembled here for us. I have my Google Maps APIs, and I'm now going to insert, or first I'm going to take some information and then insert those into the next requests. So each one of these white spaces is a page break. I'm separating out functionally the different parts of the transactions. And then these blue boxes are showing me where I'm doing little bits of inline code. So for example, I already have several variables already extracted from this Google Maps API. I'm feeding it from an input file, my location here in this request. So this will change perhaps each day if I'm in a different location, or perhaps I keep it as the same. And then as from the response, I'm actually getting an X and Y, or both an X longitude and an X latitude coordinate for my current location. And then coming into this inline code, and the way that it's ingested by the Google Places API is I need to send it as both these values comma separated. So here you can see that this inline code is something very simple. I'm just making a new variable, appending these two together. And if I wanted to test this, I'll just hit this play button here, execute this code, and we can see what this output looks like. So something very simple that we don't need to mess around with JavaScript or testing that in a separate IDE. Everything is self-contained here. So I'm taking this location coordinate, and now I'm coming into Google Places, and I need to attach my location to this request. So now I'm looking in the request details of this Google Places API. And I can see here in the query parameters that this is the location that I made on the request the first time. So I have already assembled my location coordinates. So all I'll do is I'll just hit this blue arrow. This is where I'm assigning my variables. I'll take my location coordinates, test this. It's going to replace this value here, and I'll add that. So it's really as simple as finding these blue arrows to make variable assignments, or these gray arrows to make a variable extraction. So for example, I have my location, that's now chosen. But the next you can see, I've already chosen my restaurant. I can show you where I got that in the response content here. I'm gonna look in the response content, look in this JSON tree, and I can see the results of what the Google API recommended to me for lunch. So I'll just go to this first result here. So it looks like today we're going to Ingo's Tasty Diner. I make that large enough so all of you can see. So I've already extracted this to a variable, and we can see here also that I've been given some location coordinates for this as well. I've already mapped those to variables. So now the next thing is we have where I'm going to lunch. We have where I am now, the coordinates of the restaurant. So now let's just feed this to Uber. So now to do that, it would just be as easy as coming here to create a new URL. I'm going to add this to Uber, add it after that break. And in this case, I'm not actually going to request the ride. I'm just going to do a simple get to tell me how far away it is and how much it's going to cost me. But here I'm going to bring in my Uber request, paste this here, and then there's a couple of things that I need to add to the Uber request. One of those being specifying the content type. In this case, it's application JSON. I'll just add this header here. And the other is the authorization. So this API is not going to authorize me to make the request unless I specify the authorization. So let's grab this. This is the authorization token that I can use. I'll go ahead and add this. And so this is also powered by Spring Boot here, so I can actually dynamically make these requests and test them to see that I've assembled this correctly. So I'm going to hit test, and here we can see that I have a proper 200 response. So I'm going to apply this and add this URL to my session here. So here's this Uber API call, and if I look into the details here, I can see my start and end. So let's just assign the variables that I've already extracted. I have my X starting latitude. I have my starting longitude, so XLNG. I have my ending latitude, that is Y lat, and the variable name for my ending longitude, YLNG. So now every time that I replay this request, it's going to replay this query using dynamically the information that's first fed from my input file to Google, then the suggestion, the dynamic suggestion by the Google Places API, and it's going to feed this into Uber. So in the request that I just created, I can actually inspect the content, come down here. I'm just going to pick the first one closest to me. And I can see closest to me, I have an Uber XL. It is going to be about $7 to $10, and it is 240 seconds away, so about 4 minutes away. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a variable here for this duration, and I'm going to call this wait time. add a variable, extract, and add. All right, so I think we're mostly done now. I have starting already. I have where I'm going to lunch. I've mapped that to a variable. I have how long the Uber is going to take to get to me for my wait time. So now what I want to do is I actually want to post to another service, do a post, and I'll post a message actually to my Twitter here, showing me where telling me where I'm going for lunch. And this is something that we can run as a monitoring check, and I can have this run every day dynamically and alert me at 11:30 every day and tell me where I'm going to lunch. That'd be pretty neat. So I'm going to come here, add a URL, add it to Twitter. And now I'm going to pick the request that I have saved here. And since this is something that I want to, a message that I want to post, I'm actually going to make this a post method, add the URL. And there's a couple of things. This also requires authorization as well. So I'm going to add the authorization header. And I'm going to add the content type header here. You can see that this is OAuth. Actually, this key will expire, but I'm just keeping things simple for now. We have lots of ways to extend these sorts of scripts. I can use a Java plugin, for example, here to dynamically add OAuth, do a OAuth generation for me. There's plenty of other types of plugins, OAuth being one of them. One of the things that ZebraTester was especially good at was authorization, not just for these individual calls for APIs, being able to attach OAuth, doing credential encryption, and only executing in memory, something that all of this whole tool suite can do. But also being able to attach client certificates as well. So there's a lot of support for all sorts of different authentication to the endpoints that you have, to whether it's a web-based application where we'll need to use a NTLM or Kerberos, or APIs that require certificates. So the last part here is, since this is a post, there is a request body associated with this. So I'm going to come back here and copy the request. So you can see I'm actually leaving a placeholder for my restaurant name and the number of seconds it'll take me to arrive. Something that I could do is I could actually add another bit of inline code, say, to parse the seconds, say maybe just divide by 60 to turn it into something like minutes, so that it's not so obscure. But I'm just going to keep it very, very simple for now. I'm going to test this API. I can see that we have a 200 response, and I'm going to apply. So one thing that you should be aware of as I expand the call here, if I head over to my Twitter, I actually just made that post call. So if I look into my messages, I can see that I just actually messaged myself through the API that I'm going to lunch at restaurant name in number of seconds. So that's okay for now. We know that we're able to make the call successfully. But what I want to do is actually replace the number of seconds and restaurant name in the request string with values that are actually meaningful. So let's do that right now. I'm just going to hit assign value in the constant string of my request. I'm going to find a variable like the restaurant that I chose, and I'm going to replace the text restaurant name, test, and add. I'm going to do the same with the number of seconds with my wait time. Test and add. All right, so I think we're done now. I've added all the parameterization. So now I have 4 API calls that are chained together that are, even though they're separate units, they actually are linked together to do test an actual function in coordination with one another. So I'm going to save this test here. And I'm going to execute it with you right now, actually. So built into every single one of these tools here, just like Zebra Tester, is a load generator. So I can test at various user counts. Say I wanted to iterate through 20 users concurrently, or have them execute sequentially. I can do that. I'm just going to start this test run right now with one user going through the loops here. We can see my console coming up, showing me that we've started the execution of this test. Well, actually, let's hop over to that menu right now. So here we can see this lightning bolt. That's where I first ran this local test. But if I head over to the lightning bolt at the higher level, I can see that we just completed a job here. So here's this lunch job. And if I look into the details, I can see that this is very similar to an API test that I would do in other API testing tools that you may be familiar with. I have my passes and failures here. And the thing is these are not just individual URLs we're testing. We're actually chaining them together without having to write any pre-request scripts or have any understanding of the JavaScript libraries necessary to make those pre-request scripts associate other calls together. So very, very simple for a user. And I can see here that my requests were sent. And if I look into the details, I could see, this is the test run overview, but if I look into the details, I can see the request made with the request content with my restaurant name. But an easier way to do that was, rather than looking at the logs, is just looking at my Twitter, because it's going to message me where I'm going to lunch today. So here we're going to Basile. It's a new restaurant that was selected for me. And if I order an Uber now, it'll show up in 4 minutes. So I think that's kind of where the rubber meets the road when testing, is seeing where that content shows up from the application result. Actually, we get some other things here. If there was any failures or anything like that, I'd be able to drill into them here, and also I'd be provided with additional files showing the error outputs, as well as these full outputs. We'll do a full load generator log showing you exactly what happened. So if you encountered an error type, say that there was content validation that failed. We didn't really touch on content validation, but if I wanted to validate specific JSON returns in the response, say that, for example, I would go to lunch anywhere but McDonald's, I could set that up as a failure content for me. I don't know why I'm picking on McDonald's. I was there this weekend. So that's it for the test runs here. I will do one more thing though, and head back to the solution, this Apica demo. I'm going to head over to my solution home. And so there's a couple things that I can do with these test files or these test scripts that I have. One of the most important ones, I think, is being able to automatically sync from the tool to the engine that's going to be running this regularly. I mean, we want to hook into automation. We're not going to be automating directly from the tool, say from my laptop right now, but that would be done through a system that can hook into automation. So for example, I can export this test, this script lunch, I can export this to ASM, and I've actually already done this here. So here we can see this check running in ASM for me. I can come back and see what this looks like in the dashboard alongside other checks here. I'm running this roughly every 12 hours, except looks like we just ran it again recently before the webinar here. So I can drill down into this and essentially schedule this test to run once or twice a day. And I could drill down into it and see what was chosen for lunch today. So if you're not impressed at least by the ability to chain APIs from the UI like I did, at least there's the ability to pick out something or have the ability to create a check of where to go to lunch every day. But beyond looking at this dashboard with, I have lots of checks on here, Apica is also going to include the ability to view this data in Grafana. We have a native built extension into Grafana that's going to feed this information. So here I'm saying all the checks in my account, but perhaps I want to see a more detailed level of the API results. For example, if I want to view the sort of aggregate response times of the individual calls independently from one another, or maybe I want to stack the response time from all of these calls together and see, for example, here, this Uber request took roughly a second and a half higher, making the overall transaction response time, being the culprit of what caused this overall transaction time to go above 5 seconds. So there's lots of ways that we can visualize either from a sum total up, down across all of the APIs that we are tracking, or like I said, having more functionally relevant tests that we can correlate as well. There's different ways we can visualize this. Like, for example, I'm showing a map of the world, breaking up the different locations and the different check types that I'm monitoring. So lots of ability to break up the data, not only to schedule it to run regularly, but to monitor it. And also, if we are linking this as a monitor or load test into CI/CD, adding different thresholds within Jenkins to either gate deployments or make decisions or publish alerts or reports for us as we are running these tests in an automated way. And so before I head over to the Q&A here, I do want to show, I've been spending a lot of time in the GUI, but I did want to spend a moment to show what this same script would look like as code. As you can see, these are just the requests that are mapped to a target here. So if I just have the two Google APIs targeting this Google API target, and then there's the different URIs or URL paths here. And I can see some of things like the inputs that go into this, like my Google key, for example. And what I get out of these is I can actually drill down into what I capture as a variable before I even make the request. So I don't necessarily need to map that variable. I'm just picking the JSON path of where I got the location data, my X latitude and X longitude, and then I'm feeding that X latitude and X longitude here as variables to the next request. And then I can see if I open this capture up, I can also pull out the chosen restaurant and get the coordinates for that as well. So it's very lightweight, it's very flexible, and it's, with its flexibility, it's there's a lot of developer users or developer type users or users who are just looking to have the flexibility to script as code and not necessarily be limited or chained to a UI that they need to interact with. So that is it, I think, for the demo. I'd like to open it up to questions if anybody's been saving them for this time.
Very cool. Thank you, Doug. If you would please click that blue stop sharing button at the bottom, that will let everybody get back to that questions and answers window and the main slides. Awesome. Thanks. All right, so we do already have some good questions for you. If anyone is just now thought of a question, feel free to ask it now by typing in that questions and answers panel and clicking submit. So, okay, first question for you, Doug. This person says, I use Zebra Tester often. Would you recommend switching to the Apica IDE as my primary tool to script, or when would be the best use case to use this tool?
That's a great question. So I think that each tool is really for both the user using the tool and the solution that they're applying it to. I think that the new tools that we have are great for scripting APIs and are for as powerful as Zebra Tester is, I'd say they're actually even a little bit better at it. But I still think that Zebra Tester has some components of it that make it best for scripting pure web applications. Or maybe you don't know what those APIs are and you want to record the APIs of a mobile session or something like that. The thing that ZebraTester is going to have that you're probably familiar with is that variable finder, and it's pretty smart. So it's going to find those system-generated values, throughout the session and give suggestions to you to correlate those automatically or manually handle yourself. So I think with web and mobile sessions, with the variable finder, ZebraTester is going to be a stronger workflow. But for the individual APIs that we're scripting, I think that the new tools actually have are a lot easier to work with for an API testing flow, and can be used by many more teams. I mean, I know teams that have used ZebraTester have used it for have used it to replace all sorts of tools because it's so flexible. I really see the IDE and the YAML tools gearing more towards the pure API testers as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that extra information. Next question here. You showcased automation in the slides, but didn't show exactly how the tool integrates. So how does this integration take place?
Okay, yes, I very briefly kind of glossed over it when I opened our synthetic dashboard. But the integration is, first, the scripts are maintained and built from the tool set, and the automation really happens at the SaaS level with our SaaS portal, with our SaaS tools like the synthetic monitoring and load test portal. Those have their own REST APIs that you can use to integrate with tools like Jenkins, Code Pipeline, Bamboo, for example, TeamCity. There's actually plugins as well. If you just Google, for example, Apica Jenkins plugin, there is something on the Jenkins store or the app store, or what that is there, that you can actually download a plugin that will automatically will give you a form to enter some information and automatically grab the right APIs for you to allow that integration. So you can think of the tools as where we maintain the logic for the scripts, and the SaaS tools, or the SaaS portal and Apica synthetic monitoring, Apica load test, those really as the engine that drives the transactions. So in automation, rather than doing your own building and instrumenting, and say we spin up a EC2 instance and then deploy the tool and run the scripts locally, rather than all of that and having a whole separate build, think of doing the testing as a service, as just an API call in itself to Apica load testers, Apica synthetic monitoring.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. Here's a question. This person says, I'm really interested in importing from Postman like you mentioned. Can you explain how that works?
Yes. So there's a getting started guide when you install the Apica IDE toolchain, and there is what's going to be required is getting the Postman collection file specified. So you have all the calls maintained in that collection. The only limiting factor really is the pre-request scripts aren't going to be brought over, just the requests themselves. So that's not often going to be too much of a problem, for example, because if there are variables that are declared in Postman, they would just come over as bracketed variables into the Apica tools. So there really wouldn't be anything missing. We would just need to redeclare what those, re-input the data for whatever those parameters are.
Okay, thank you. And that was actually all the questions we had. So I think that will end the web seminar for today, Doug. I would like to thank Doug McAfee for his time and Apica for sponsoring this web seminar. And of course, a special thanks goes out to all of you in the audience for spending your time with us here today. So everybody have a great day, and we hope to see you at a future event.